Hello, I'm Craig Enser. I'm with Professor Clifford Endres in his office in Kadir Has University, where he teaches American literature and languages, I believe. And I'm here to ask about his interest in history and his study on the Roditi family. So perhaps we could start with your background and what made you start on this quest,
Sure.
shall we say.
Sure. Well, you say American literature and culture, that's only part of what we do here. We teach, the department should really be called literature, period.
Mm-hmm.
Literature
Right.
in general. So we do classics, we do European, we do English, we do a lot of translation, excuse me, literary translation, and we do American literature and culture. So Edouard Roditi is, although he was born in Paris in 1910, was an American citizen and a world traveler whose roots lie in Constantinople, Istanbul, and the Levant. So I first encountered him in a special issue of Mediterranean Review, which focused on Istanbul, and I ran across a wonderful piece of his in there called The Vampires of Istanbul,
Right.
which is a lovely satire. And
What year was that published?
That was published in 95, 96, something like
so
that.
towards the end of his life.
Well, he died in 1992, so he was
okay,
on.
post.
So it was a reprint. It was a reprint
okay.
from a book of his called The Delights of Turkey,
Right.
which came out in the 1960s and consists of short prose narratives
In English, was published in English?
published in English by New
Right.
Directions
Right.
by James Laughlin, all of which I discovered later because I just was knocked out by this piece. I thought, how could this guy know so much about Istanbul, a guy I'd never heard of?
Right.
So I said to myself, how did he learn this? And then I started doing some research. I discovered that it was a reprint. And I discovered that he was the translator of Yasar Kemal's book, Mehmet My Hawk. And then I thought, how can that come to be?
Was he like the first translator, or was he just one of the translators?
He was the first translator.
Wow.
Well, as a matter of fact, it was Yashar Bey's wife, Tilda, who was the primary translator of that book.
Tilda being an American citizen?
Tilda was an Istanbulite from an old Sephardic family here, the Serreros.
Right.
Tilda Serrero.
So Yasar Kemal was married to a local Jewess.
He became married to her, yes.
Yeah, okay, right.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm. And when he and Tilda got married, well, she thought that Ince Mehmet My Hawk, should be translated as it should have.
Sure.
And there's a whole story, there's a backstory there. It was Derek Patmore, the British journalist, who was a good friend of Roditi from the 1930s. Patmore found a publisher for Yasar Kemal's novel,
Right.
and he told, and he arranged for Roditi to be the nominal translator of the book, so that it could be published. I think it was HarperCollins, if I remember right.
Okay, right.
And he,
Well, it's a classic, obviously. It's yeah.
it was Billy Collins that Patmore met.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and Patmore was a friend of both of Roditi and of Yasar Kemal's. So he put the deal together. Tilda did most of the translation because she knew Turkish and English. Edward's Turkish, according to Yashar Bey, was Ortudan Kutuya,
So,
from middling to bad.
right, okay.
But Ince Mehmet came out, it was published in Britain, it was published in America, it was a great success, and it had Edward's name as the translator of record on it because he was a much more valuable literary commodity than Tilda Kemal at that time.
And I think you've done work to trace the Roditi lineage back,
Yes.
really far back.
Yes.
And I mean, is there mystery there? I mean, it's
Well, I thought, what is the connection of Edouard Roditi to Istanbul or Constantinople? And then I learned from Yasar at the time that Edward's father, Oscar, was the chief supervisor of the Para Palace. So he built the Para Palace, which was completed in 1895, if I remember right.
So as an architect rather than as a contractor?
He was not an architect, he was the engineer, he was the supervisor of the job as far as I can make out.
Okay, gotcha, right.
And interestingly, as a sidelight, and now Edward writes about all this. A lot of this is published in his memoirs, and in fact I have 750 pages, manuscript pages of Edward's unpublished memoirs here, which I have managed to find. I don't know why, because I seem to be some kind of magnet for...
Any plans to publish this? Or is it just, you know...
Well, he mined it. So one or two chapters of that have been published in Grand Street and other places. And one of those had to do with his father's experiences during the building of the Para Palace. That coincided with one of the Armenian massacres. And because Edward's father, Oscar, was associated with the railroad lines,
right? Okay.
He knew shipping agents. So it was actually, I'm having a memory lapse here. Chalust, what's the Armenian fellow who ended up in Portugal? Melanchian?
Well, we don't need to go into great detail now. Let's concentrate on the Roditi side.
The man who founded Occident Petroleum.
Oh, right, okay. Important guy, right, okay.
So he was, Edward's father was approached to help the Armenians get out of town. And he did find a ship. And he put some hundreds of Armenians on that ship, and they left Constantinople for Cairo. And amongst those was the founder of the Occidental Petroleum Company.
Wow.
All this is written down by Edward. It doesn't need to be, rewritten.
Yeah, but obviously it's a shame it never got published. There's clearly architectural gems in that.
Yes, there
because
are.
He was in the middle of a lot of things. He was an influential writer, I think. He was a translator in a lot of important events, like the Nuremberg trials, I believe. And
yes, he wore several hats.
Yeah.
One of those was as a translator. So he was born in 1910. By the time he was 18 in 1928, he was publishing surrealistic poems in Transition and other literary magazines, little literary magazines, Parisian literary magazines of the time, and became a kind of cultural ambassador. So even then, he was introducing people like Charles Henry Ford from America to the Parisian scene.
Right.
Well, when he finally came to Istanbul in the 1950s, because he had come here for a translator's job in Ankara, he had translated for the Nuremberg trials, and he had translated for the UN organization.
So did he also know German?
He knew German very well.
How come?
He knew German, French, Greek, Italian, Spanish, and professed to know Turkish.
Were you like a genius? I mean...
He was like a genius, and there's a whole branch of Roditi studies that studies his contributions to translation and interpretation theory.
Oh, because he broke new ground, shall we say. He was that good.
Well, he was that good. I mean, they needed good simultaneous translation. It's not an easy thing to do.
Clearly, yeah.
Now, meanwhile, he was a poet and a surrealistic short prose writer. I was interested in tracing his literary output. I was not particularly interested in following up his biography or in following up his connections in the Near East, except that when he came to Istanbul and met his cousin Teodor Severo and then Yasar and got involved in translating Yasar Kemal's novels, he met all of Yasar Bey's friends, who were the literary and artistic producers of 1950s and 60s Istanbul.
He was in the center of the intellectual circle. Not in Turkey, but also in other places as well.
That's right, he was. But
Right.
especially he became a go-between between the Turkish artists and writers here and those that had gone off in exile to Paris. For example, Abedin Dino was already in Paris,
Right.
and Edward was a messenger back in.
And he was an art critique as well.
Hmm?
He was an art critique as well. He was
He
one
was
of the
an
first
art
art critics of Turkey, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. He arranged for the Turkish representation in the Edinburgh Art Festival in 1957 or 58.
Right.
Mhm. Together with
So it's
Jared
amazing
Kaplan.
he's hardly known in Turkey today.
And
you know?
he wrote critical pieces on all those artists
Right.
for French and English publications. So his art criticism is vast.
Now, if we go back in time,
Mhm.
his father, grandfather, great-grandfather, how far can you take it back?
Well, his grandfather left Constantinople in the 1880s and went to Boston to set up shop. He didn't.
Okay.
He didn't take to America that well, so he moved back to Paris.
Right.
Whereas I said before, he was a friend of the Commando family, and there were a lot of people who were shifting at that time. Old Istanbul families shifting to Paris. He was one of those. Now, I don't know much about. All I know beyond Edward's grandfather is what Edward himself has written. So Edward became a kind of icon for the beat poets, for the beats. Gregory Corso, Allen
Okay.
Ginsberg.
I mean, it's almost like who he didn't know is a shorter list than who he knew.
Exactly, you have it there, right?
Wow.
So, for example, I mean, a quick footnote: it was Edward who was responsible for, according to Shakir Eczacıbaşı, it was Edward who was responsible for the founding of the first Cinematheque in Istanbul in 1963, because Shakir and Sabahattin Eyüboğlu were the two co-founders of that Cinematheque. Well, they
Right.
knew Edward, and they went to Paris to get introductions.
Sure.
And
Does he have descendants? Did he have children and stuff?
he did not.
Ah, okay.
He never married.
Right. So there might or there might not be local distant cousins, maybe.
There are local cousins, but I've been unable to turn any up.
Okay.
What Edward says in his autobiographical writings is that the family goes back to Rhodes and has some kind of roots in the old Galata, families of the 12th and 13th century. So that would be Genoese, Venetian, Italian. So there's that part of the family, and then there's
Right.
the Greek part of the family that comes from Rhodes, hence the surname Roditi.
So you could say that they might have Byzantine blood, they might have Latin blood. You know, it might
That's
be.
right. That's right.
And the name suggests it's not like a pure Sephardic
That's right.
Jewish type sort of
That's right.
heritage.
He says so. Well, the family is Jewish, and according to Edward, they are both Romaniot and Sephardic.
Wow.
So there's a merging there.
Right. So it's almost like this is the start of Roditi studies, you could say,
Yeah.
because there's this. It's like a little mine here that's waiting to be
Yeah.
excavated.
Yeah, and there's a Roditi Brothers printing press that operated in Izmir in the 16th century. Jewish
Right.
printing
Good,
press.
yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. This is just obviously a brief introduction, and hopefully we'll collaborate and perhaps some questions will be answered.
Well, thank
After
you. It's a
that.
pleasure. I hope that people will, contact me and we
Right.
can find out more about this very interesting figure.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Mhm.